Thank you very much.
Oh, that's good. Really interesting. Yes, you mentioned drone strikes. I wonder if you could talk about the deliberations that have gone into the drone strikes in view of the fact that they have undoubtedly killed a so far undisclosed number of civilians. I'd just be very interested to know about that.
Absolutely. So chapter 6 of my book is about targeted killings. And one of the takeaways of it, by the way, is that it's a fallacy to think of it purely through the lens of drone strikes, because what we're really talking about is killing. And from a legal perspective, and even a policy perspective, that's what matters. And whether you kill someone with a drone or you kill someone with a missile fired from a traditional aircraft that has a pilot sitting in it, or whether you have a sniper that shoots him or you hit him over the head with a rock, sometimes it's legal to kill and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's a good idea to kill and sometimes it's not. But the technology is irrelevant to those equations. So therefore, in the targeted killing chapter, I have a huge amount about the backstory and the deliberations about the Osama bin Laden raid, which was obviously not a drone strike, although they considered it a drone strike. But that's where it belongs. They decided to go kill this guy, and they did. The drone strikes had started to ratchet up in 2008 when Bush struck a deal with the Pakistani government allowing strikes aimed at large groups of militants who seemed to be massing along the border with Afghanistan, even though they did not know who those people were specifically. It's called signature strikes. They looked like they were militants. And Pakistan, as long as they were in the tribal region and as long as we didn't say publicly we were doing that, permitted us to strike them. And they continued to escalate in 2009 and 2010, in part because of that policy and in part because more and more drones were coming online and that it simply were more in the air able to take shots. And then they sort of started to recede in Pakistan but escalated in Yemen, where AQAP, which was behind the Christmas attack, was based. The most interesting, and then they've ratcheted down from there. And Obama put some new rules in 2013, which he had developed in 2012 when it was possible he would lose to Romney. They were designed to have a higher standard before the shot would be taken, and including fewer risk of civilian casualties, although they grandfathered in Pakistan as long as American forces were on the ground. And there's been a lot of controversy about whether those rules were all that they were cracked up to be as far as a constraint. Certainly the total number of strikes, though, is dramatically less today than it was 2010 to 2012. The most interesting deliberation, the bin Laden stuff is fascinating because it's bin Laden, right? But the most interesting deliberation, I think, in that chapter is about killing Anwar al-Awlaki, the American citizen who became this radical preacher in Yemen for al-Qaeda's affiliate there, and they say evolved into someone who was not just giving sermons saying jihad is good, but actually recruiting people to go on specific operations, including that Christmas attack. The decision to kill him without a trial set a new precedent in the relationship between American citizens and the state, something Obama did that even Bush had not done, the deliberate killing of an American. And set off a huge fascinating internal dilemma for the lawyers who were asked to decide whether this would be lawful. Two of whom, David Barron and Marty Lederman, at the Justice Department Office of Legal Counsel, had been enormous critics of the Bush administration's expansive views of executive power. They had written this book-length law review article about Bush's saying that he, as commander-in-chief, could blow through statutory constraints, and now they were being asked to sign off on an extraordinary executive power too, and they did so sort of rapidly, and then they made a mistake, and they missed a statute that seemed to bar what they wanted to do, and they had to come back and do a much longer memo and send all these sort of shockwaves through the government, and they eventually got to yes anyway in a way that didn't clash with their previous legal positions, but that's one of the most controversial things that Obama and his legal team did. And just to add a sort of more abstract note, I shouldn't ramble on too much here. One of the questions people sometimes ask me is when I make this case that Obama's been very lawyerly and his administration's been very lawyerly, and it's like, Bush had this sort of cartoonish view of the law that he could do anything, and they would write these 2-page memos and say, I'm the commander-in-chief, we're done. And Obama and his people would have these agonizing 100-page memos that goes through all the possible implications and well, we couldn't always do this, and we couldn't do it under these circumstances, and here's the objections, but here's this one thing you want to do, like killing Anwar al-Awlaki. You can do that, right? And so the question is, did he ever was it just clever, legalistic lawyering, creative lawyering, where the law was just for show, but it never actually served as a constraint? And my answer to that is no, that's too far. I went looking for a lot of examples, and I only found a few, but I found some where the law actually prevented them from doing something that they wanted to do. The most obvious example is Guantanamo remains open. Clearly, Obama would have moved everyone to Charleston or Fort Leavenworth years ago, if not. We'll see whether that stays won by the end of his administration, though. But there are others, and not to go through all of them, but it's also a question of how the law influenced their deliberations. So this is to stay within the realm of targeted killing. It's too simple to say we want to do X, we can't do X because of the law, we're not going to do X. Because the law shapes which X you decide you want to do, at least in this administration. They were very interested in what the legal authority was, what the legal justification was going to be, both to themselves and publicly, and that steered them away often from things that would have been more legally problematic, not always. And so an example of that was in early 2010, when they figured out that probably Osama bin Laden is in this compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, then the question turns to what should we do about it? And the first option they consider would have been a lot easier and less risky than sending Navy SEALs deep into Pakistani territory on helicopters to attack the compound. The first option is bomb it to dust, and bomb it so hard that if there's tunnels under it, everyone in that compound is dead. And that raised an issue because it wasn't some isolated compound up on a mountaintop somewhere. It was in the middle of a city. It was in the middle of a residential neighborhood. And if you hit a house with that much ordnance in the middle of a residential neighborhood, you're going to kill everyone in the houses around it as well. There would have been easily 100 or more civilian casualties of people who didn't even know bin Laden was there, let alone the kids that are in his house. And so that could be legal. The lawyers probably would have signed off on that, I think, if Obama wanted to. But they were going through this whole analysis because in war, some civilian casualties, collateral damage is lawful. It just has to be necessary. It has to be proportionate to a legitimate military aim. The military aim of killing the head of al-Qaeda is vast. Therefore, a lot of collateral damage would probably be reasonably deemed necessary and proportionate. But just the fact that they were talking about that and how much would be too much put front and center that there was going to be a lot of collateral damage. And that had policy implications as well. How is the world going to react to that, especially if we can't prove he was there? And that steered the conversation away from that course of action towards the raid they eventually took. So that's not an example where he wanted to do X, because he never got to the point where he said, I want to do X, and the law stops him. But it's an example of how legal thinking and an attention to the law influences the shape of the deliberations.
I was curious, you had mentioned that a lot of these policy decisions are not very effective, such as the mass gathering of NSA, of data by the NSA. I would add the TSA screenings to that list as well. Why do you think that administrations continue to keep these policies in play when they have proven to not be very effective in the past?
It's a great question. I mean, I spoke specifically just about what the empirical results have been of the bulk phone data program. I haven't expressed any opinion on the TSA screening or anything, but the broader question of, well, why do they keep something that doesn't seem to be doing anything? I think that what a lot of the stories in the book show is how hard it is to turn off something in this realm once it's turned on. Because even if it hasn't been effective in the past, doesn't mean it won't be effective tomorrow, right? That's an unknowable thing. And the argument that if you're the guy or the woman who turned off X and then tomorrow something blows up and the next 9/11 commission shows that but for the turning off of that thing, this would have been caught, that you'll have the blood on your hands is just an overwhelming thing to deal with bureaucratically. So whether you're a judge on the intelligence court and Bush has started this vast surveillance program unilaterally and now it can't continue unless you bless it, and it's like, judge, you got to bless this or the blood will be on your hands if you make us turn this thing off. Or it even, so that's at the programmatic level, but I think that also partially explains the great difficulty they've had getting the Guantanamo detainees out of Guantanamo who were approved for transfer. It's like, well, why are they all, now they're down to about 30, but for a while they had like 100 people at Gitmo who had been recommended for transfer if security conditions were met in 2009, and it was like 2014, and they were still there. Why? It is part because Congress had passed a law that said the Secretary of Defense specifically has to personally review each of these transfers and certify to Congress that he thinks it's safe. And that means if they release 100 people and 99 of them go on to just live quiet lives, but one of them goes and shoots somebody outside of the American consulate in whatever country it is, that person who is dead because this person put his name on the piece of paper. The blood is on his hands. And that is, so ex ante, you're looking forward, and you don't know which of these 100 people it's going to be, but undoubtedly there's some risk. It just gives you pause. And so why do things that don't seem to make sense, but why do you turn them off? Is you just don't want to be the one who did that. It's too risky.
But it's also always interesting to me how quickly we grow impatient with prophylactic security measures. I mean, one could say that we had the whole spate of hijackings with the guy going up to the cockpit with a gun in the 60s and the 70s, and then finally a system of metal detectors and a security system that is nothing compared to the net that exists today finally is put in place, and we stop having those kinds of hijackings. And you can look at that and say, well, over the last 30 years, you can only point out a handful of times that the system stopped that kind of a hijacking. But had that system not been there, there's no doubt that we would have continued to have all sorts of hijackings.
Because you don't know how deterrence is playing into
Exactly. Just like there are relatively few attempts on the life of the president, but that's largely because people know that if they attempt to take the life of the president, it's almost certain they'll be thwarted and they'll probably be killed. And so people don't do it. And so it's striking.
Although with the bulk phone records program and its demonstrated lack of thwarting attacks from 2001 to 2003, no one knew it was there, right?
Yeah,
so
sure. No, I agree with that.
That sense of, we better not call each other.
Yeah, but for instance, the TSA screenings, that's one that I think, I experience everybody else's frustration as well, but I'm happy to experience it because I think the chaos theory of that you never quite know what's going to happen, that's the whole idea, that it's a different screen from one day to the next. Well, that's one reason why you decide not to try to do that. But I also have a higher tolerance for
But yes,
this
remember
particular.
after 9/11, they had guys walking around, Penn Station with machine guns, like it was so ridiculous,
Yeah.
right? So there's also the security theater where
Sure.
you don't quite know what to do, but you can do this, so let's do that.
Let's do that.
You don't know where to search, but let's look where the light is good.
I'm curious about what you learned from the many interviews you conducted about Secretary Clinton's contributions, influence on what's happened in the during the Obama administration.
Great, obviously a tremendous, interesting question right now. The State Department was obviously a huge player in this. Her lawyer, Harold Koh, was a hugely influential member of the Obama legal team, in part because he had her backing, but he was also sort of an independent actor in trying to constrain certain things in the drone strike world and approving other things. Some of the places where she played the most direct role was in pushing the Obama White House to be more aggressive in trying, and then growing frustrated when she failed, in trying to wind down Guantanamo. Not just sort of like saying that this was what they were trying to do, but not actually doing anything bureaucratically to achieve their policy. It was her department that was going out and diplomatically in the world and trying to find places to send these guys on the transfer list. And then when there was bureaucratic disagreement about whether to take that deal, the White House was not lifting a finger to push it through the system. And there's a very interesting moment where she basically on her way out the door, she rescues the guy, Dan Freed, who was the chief diplomat in charge of striking these deals. She had written a memo to the White House saying, you've got to get much more serious about this, you've got to revive these efforts, and they blew her off. And she'd said that to Obama personally, and he was like, we got this, And so, but no one was moving. About a year had passed since the last person left Guantanamo. And so this guy whose job was to strike these deals, and it was pointless. He was striking deals that were not then moving. She transfers him to a different role in the State Department. And instead of replacing him, she closes down his office. And this is a clear signal that the Guantanamo closure effort is dead, whatever the White House might say. And she doesn't tell the White House she's going to do this. The White House finds out because I found out, and I wrote an article about it, and they get to read about it in the paper. Just like Condi Rice reading about, hey, we've got military commissions now, and guess what? And that was a clear, slap to the ineffectiveness or the fecklessness, as she saw it, of the White House on this issue. So, a story.
I'm struck by an irony that we've got a bunch of lawyers at the senior levels of the Obama foreign policy team, several of whom were also senators and politicians. And one of the ongoing debates is that the administration has not taken Congress seriously over its 8 years. And the irony is that they're very legalistic and laws are passed by the Congress. So I'm curious to know on this set of issues, particularly in that first year from the time they're inaugurated through the failed underwear bombing and the months after that, what the White House Congress set of discussions are about these, either publicly, also privately, and how much those former senators are talking to Congress.
So you're especially interested in the first year?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously after the Tea Party midterm, when the House comes into Republican hands, the rules all change. And I think the critique that Obama, if only he'd schmoozed more, would have had a substantive outcome, strikes me as totally fatuous. The structural dynamics were different. His evolution towards wanting to work with Congress and sort of respect the role of Congress on these national security issues, to being kind of Congress is a dangerous place to engage in, I think pivots in the spring of 2009. In April of 2009, he gives a speech at the National Archives. Cheney's been beating him up, and he describes his national security policy and why he's trying to thread the needle in this way. And he acknowledges that they're going to have to keep holding some people at Guantanamo without trial because they're too dangerous to release but not triable. But he says, I don't think it should be up to one person to sort of decide these standards, and I'm going to work with Congress to decide what the rules should be. And by 2 or 3 months later, he's abandoned the idea of trying to get a statute through Congress that says, here's how it's going to work. And the difference, what the pivotal moment was, it came out that there were these Chinese Muslims at Guantanamo who had been brought there by mistake. They were called the Uyghurs. They had just been swept up in Afghanistan, but it turns out they were not Al-Qaeda, and they didn't want to attack the United States. If they wanted to attack anyone, it was Beijing. Their enemy was Communist China. They were not part of our war, and they should. And it was not even clear they wanted to attack anyone. They were just sort of more like refugees from China, although some of them had received weapons training. And we were having trouble getting rid of them. The court had ruled you got to get rid of them. The government didn't think they had legal authority to, but they couldn't be sent back to China because they'd be killed immediately. And China was using its diplomatic weight to prevent other countries from taking them in. Don't you do it, we'll mess with you. And so there was a plan to bring 2 of them to Northern Virginia, where there is a Uyghur community. These were the 2 that spoke English the best and were sort of the most westernized. And the idea was, we'll let them live there under close monitoring, and the fact that we took some in will help us persuade other countries to take the rest of them in. Maybe this was a good plan, maybe it wasn't. But in any case, the congressman in Northern Virginia, in whose district this was, his name was Frank Wolf, I think he's retired now, found out about it and went ballistic and started sort of saying, this is like bringing Osama bin Laden and dropping him off on the street, and he's going to kill your kids. And other people like Newt Gingrich joined in and said, why is Obama trying to spread terrorism in America? And these guys weren't terrorists, right? And they were the most sympathetic of all the detainees. But Congress there was no political support for it, and they were trying to get health care through, and it was like this turbulence they didn't need. And they immediately backed off, and that's when the first transfer restrictions get passed by the Democratic Congress that said you cannot bring anyone into the United States from Gitmo and release them under any circumstances. And that they kind of got rolled at that point, and that's the origin story of all this, but that's also where they suddenly decided Congress, as currently constituted, is not a place where you can have a serious conversation about these difficult dilemmas and trade-offs. It's just a place where people are going to demagogue and try to score political points. And so when they ultimately do come up with rules for the detainees they're going to keep holding, Obama does it with executive order rather than with statute. And to this day, they say to Congress, how about you pass an authorization for, fighting ISIS? And Congress is too feckless to do that. And so that's part of the reason why they came up with this disputed theory that ISIS is the same thing as Al-Qaeda, even though they're fighting each other, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because ISIS used to be part of Al-Qaeda and then broke away. And the reason was they didn't trust Congress to get its act together and pass a war authorization, and they needed to do something. And but I think all that goes back to the Uyghur moment, when they first decided that Congress was not a place where serious people were.
The Uyghurs were ultimately comfortably ensconced,
Yep.
not in that original arrangement, but they're
Well, not here, though. They went to Bermuda.
exactly. They have a very lovely life in Bermuda. It's a funny story.
One of the most interesting critiques of Obama's foreign policy, especially from an academic point of view, is sort of his failure to ever issue a grand strategy. And that's something that I know is thrown around a lot. It's certainly in the ivory tower, but it's interesting to me that you broke your book up as you did, very section-oriented with your 11 topics. Because to me, that is almost the acknowledgement as well, that there is no real grand strategy lens to view all this from. And so I guess, could you extrapolate a little bit on Obama's national security directives and his lack thereof of grand strategy or overwhelming vision for how all of his national security policies fit together?
And this gets at what I was saying earlier about, it turns out there wasn't one pendulum but many, and it's all irreducibly complex. I think it's right that there's not like a bumper sticker way of summing up Obama. In his national security policies, you can draw some broad observations. He clearly accepts the notion that this is war. Some liberals, and especially in European allies, still don't think that there can be such a thing as a war against a non-state actor like Al-Qaeda. He thinks there is, and therefore things like killing people and holding them without trial are legally available. He doesn't want to do it as a first resort, though. He wants to do it as a last resort, and he has this sort of everything is sort of, he wants there to be recognizable legal authority for everything. Sometimes he succeeds in that, and sometimes people disagree with his argument that this is lawful. I think over time he's clearly evolved from someone who wanted to not be Bush and not be Cheney, and to show that you could fight this war within a recognizable framework of law, or do things within law, to the foil instead of Bush and Cheney being the Republican Congress and wanting to just get things done and govern and put out fires even in the face of what he considers dysfunction and obstructionism. And he's gone from disavowing executive power to not just using it, but embracing it as a sort of campaign tool. We can't wait for Congress, so I'm going to sign this executive action. That's more in the realm of domestic policy than national security, but I think it all traces back to his Libya intervention, which was right after the Congress turned over, and there was this problem, and they were just messed up to vote on something that at the time they wanted him to do, and he just did it anyway. And it sort of taught him that if he asks for authority and congressional dysfunction ties his hands, but if he claims, even controversial, that he has authority, that same dysfunction empowers him because they're unable to respond in any kind of coherent way. And so that means they acquiesce, essentially, and ratify the authority by not disputing it.
You were talking about the deep part of government and how it resists oncoming presidents because it's entrenched and it doesn't pass on with a new administration. What is your view of Clinton's emails? Was it an effort to avoid that part of government and the deep government and discussion about policy with her private server, and where do you think it's all going to sort out?
I don't know what her motive was, but it can't have been to avoid deep government seeing what she was talking about, because everyone else she was emailing was using their State Department email to email her. She was the only, maybe Huma had one too, but it was, for the most part, takes two to tango in an email exchange, and so the same message is sitting here and there. Obviously, in retrospect, colossal error. So how I think it's going to play out, I think that, we're going to keep hearing about it all year.
She was trying to avoid you, not the
Right,
folks in the
right,
State
right. So the
Department.
argument is,
That's
well,
what
maybe
she was
she's trying to avoid the Freedom of Information Act, but
Right.
still, the flip
Still,
side of that
it's
email is sitting
naive,
over there.
the naivete of that is the most concerning.
No, but
element of
even that, but
whole
even the argument that the freedom
equation.
of, she was trying to avoid congressional oversight of the freedom. Why do we have all her emails even though she erased them? It's because they still existed on the
Exactly.
people who were sending and receiving emails from her. So the whole thing is inexplicable.
And we'll end on the word inexplicable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.